AITA for not attending my sister's wedding because of her wedding tax. So, a little background to set the stage. My younger sister, Emily, is getting married in 2 months. Emily and I have always been close, or at least I thought we were. Growing up, we were those sisters who bickered like crazy but always had each other's backs when it really mattered. I'm the older one, so I've always felt a bit protective of her. I've supported her through breakups, career changes, and the occasional family drama. When she got engaged to her fiancé, Tyler, I was genuinely thrilled for her. I even cried when she called to tell me the news. Now, Emily has always had a bit of a flair for the dramatic. She's the type who loves big, splashy gestures and has a Pinterest board for literally everything. When it came to her wedding, I wasn't surprised when she told me she wanted it to be a dream wedding. Fine, that's her choice. But then she started talking about how expensive everything was going to be. I suggested that maybe she could scale back a bit, do something more intimate or budget-friendly. She laughed it off and said, "Don't worry, we have a plan." Well, the plan turned out to be something I was not prepared for. A few weeks later, Emily called a family meeting. My parents, me, and a couple of our aunts and uncles were invited over to her place. I thought it was going to be a fun little update on her wedding planning, maybe showing us her dress or talking about the venue. Instead, she and Tyler handed out these printed spreadsheets titled Wedding Budget Breakdown. At first, I thought, wow, they're really organized. Then I started reading it. The spreadsheet listed every single expense for their wedding in meticulous detail, almost like they were preparing for a corporate budget meeting instead of a family celebration. At the very top, in bold letters, was the total amount they needed to pull off their vision, an eye-watering $75,000. Below that, the breakdown began. The venue alone, a breathtakingly expensive 5-star hotel that charges for everything down to the napkins, was over $25,000. Catering, which included a 4-course plated dinner, was another $15,000. Then there were the floral arrangements, $8,000 worth of cascading roses, hydrangeas, and peonies. Not to mention the live band that would cost $6,000 for the evening, a professional photographer charging $5,000. Custom wedding favors etched with their initials for $3,000, and even a separate budget line for luxury restroom trailers, because apparently the hotel's facilities weren't good enough for Emily's big day. It just kept going. I remember blinking a few times, thinking maybe I was hallucinating. But no, it was all there, printed out in clear, black and white text. And then I saw the kicker. At the very bottom of the sheet was a section titled Family Contributions. That's right, Emily and Tyler weren't just sharing this list for transparency or to get input. They were outright asking each family member to chip in a specific, pre-calculated amount to help cover these exorbitant costs. It was laid out like some kind of financial draft, with every name next to a suggested contribution. When my eyes found my name, I almost choked. My contribution was set at $500, but there was a fine print note below saying that depending on how many guests RSVP'd, the number could rise to as much as $1,000. Apparently, I was expected to shoulder part of the burden if other people decided not to come. I glanced further down and saw that my parents were being asked to contribute over $3,000 because, as the hosts of the couple's table, they were being charged extra for the privilege of sitting with the bride and groom. My jaw dropped when I noticed my 18-year-old cousin's name on the list with a $200 contribution. She's a college freshman working part-time at a coffee shop, barely making ends meet, and they were asking her for $200 like it was spare change. Emily and Tyler sat at the head of the table, looking so proud of their plan. Emily launched into an explanation, as if we should all be grateful for the opportunity to help fund their vision. She said they wanted a luxurious, once-in-a-lifetime wedding but admitted they couldn't afford it on their own. So, they thought it was only fair to share the financial load with the family. Tyler chimed in, saying it was a much better system than expecting expensive gifts, as if that somehow made it okay. Then Emily added the part that still makes my blood boil. Obviously, if you're not contributing, you probably shouldn't attend. It wouldn't be fair to the people who are helping. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. I could see my dad furrowing his brow, clearly trying to process what he was hearing, while my mom stared at the sheet with a tight, uncomfortable smile. My aunts and uncles exchanged awkward glances but stayed silent, probably trying to avoid making waves. I just sat there, gripping the paper, feeling a mix of shock, disbelief, and anger. I could feel my blood boiling, but I bit my tongue. My dad asked if this was normal for weddings. It's not, obviously, and Emily said it was becoming more common these days and that she'd read about it on some wedding blog. Tyler chimed in, saying it was better than expecting expensive gifts. My mom looked uncomfortable but didn't say much, and my aunts just nodded along awkwardly. I, however, couldn't stay quiet anymore. I told Emily that I thought this whole thing was incredibly tacky and unfair. I said that weddings are supposed to be about celebrating love, not shaking down your family for money. She immediately got defensive and said I was being unsupportive. I countered that asking people to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars to attend a wedding was not only unreasonable but downright insulting. Things escalated quickly, and before I knew it, we were yelling at each other in front of everyone. I left the meeting fuming and figured she'd cool off and realize how ridiculous she was being. Waited because I said everything I thought. Update 1. The next morning, I woke up to a long text from Emily. I was still half asleep when my phone buzzed, but as soon as I saw her name on the screen, my heart sank. I already knew it wasn't going to be an apology. Emily doesn't do apologies. She does guilt trips, and this one was Olympic level. The text began with her telling me how deeply hurt she was by my reaction at the family meeting. She wrote that she felt like I didn't care about her happiness and accused me of being selfish and unsupportive. She doubled down, saying that she and Tyler had worked so hard to make their wedding perfect and that the least I could do as her sister was show up and support her vision. It was clear she wasn't looking for a conversation, she was looking for validation. But the part that really got to me, the part that made me audibly scoff, was when she said I didn't understand how important this wedding was to her, as if I wasn't fully aware. As if I hadn't spent the past few months listening to her talk nonstop about her Pinterest boards and venue tour, and how she wanted to outdo her friends' weddings. I knew exactly how important this wedding was to her. What she didn't seem to grasp was how her demands were affecting everyone else. I started typing a response, trying to be measured but firm. I told her I loved her and wanted to support her, but I felt like the way she was going about this was unfair to the family. I said I didn't think it was right to put a financial burden on people just to achieve a luxurious wedding, especially when some of us were already stretching our budgets just to attend. I also told her that blocking me was hurtful and unnecessary, and that I hoped we could have a real conversation about this. Before I could even hit send, I got the dreaded notification. You can no longer send messages to this contact. She had blocked me. My own sister, over a disagreement about her wedding. I sat there staring at my phone in disbelief. I'd been frustrated with her before. Emily can be a lot to handle, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just petty, it felt calculated, like she was punishing me for not falling in line. And for a week, that was it. Radio silence. During that week, I tried to process everything. I talked to my parents about it, hoping they might talk some sense into her, but they were no help. My mom just sighed and said, "You know how Emily is. She's under a lot of stress right now." My dad said he didn't like the wedding tax either but thought it wasn't worth fighting over. They both encouraged me to apologize, even though I hadn't done anything wrong, just to smooth things over. Meanwhile, my friends were having a field day dissecting the situation. They told me I was absolutely right to feel the way I did and that Emily was being entitled and manipulative, but none of that made me feel any better. At the end of the day, she was my sister, and the idea of not being there for her wedding felt wrong, no matter how ridiculous she was being. Eventually, an envelope arrived in the mail. I'll admit, for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was Emily extending an olive branch. Maybe she'd come to her senses and realized how absurd the whole thing was. But the second I opened it, that hope vanished. Inside was a formal wedding invitation, complete with gold embossing and all the bells and whistles. But tucked inside was a printed note, yes, printed, as if she couldn't even be bothered to write it herself, reminding me to complete my contribution before RSVPing. The note literally said, "If you're unable to contribute, we understand, but we respectfully ask that you not attend." I read it 3 times, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Nope. It was all there, in cold, impersonal text. Not only was she doubling down on the wedding tax, but she was outright excluding people who couldn't or wouldn't pay. My jaw hit the floor. I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and complete disbelief. This wasn't the sister I grew up with. This wasn't the Emily who used to stay up late with me watching bad rom-coms and sharing popcorn. This was someone else entirely, someone who cared more about her vision than her relationships. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just the money, though that was a big part of it. It was the principle. Weddings are supposed to be about love and family and bringing people together, not about extorting your loved ones to fund a luxury event. And to add insult to injury, I wasn't even a bridesmaid. She had chosen her 3 best friends from college, all of whom had deep pockets, to stand beside her. Not that I was dying to be a bridesmaid, I know how much work that can be, but it still stung. It felt like I was being treated as an afterthought, like my only value to her was financial. And the costs didn't stop at the contribution. The wedding was being held at this ridiculously expensive hotel, the kind of place you see in luxury travel magazines, where the marble floors gleam, the chandeliers look like they belong in a royal palace, and the staff probably get paid just to stand there and look polished. Emily had made it very clear in her invitation, and I do mean very clear that guests were responsible for their own accommodations. There was even a cheerful little line in the invitation reminding us to book early to secure the best rates, as though that would somehow make the sting of the costs less painful. I went online to check out the hotel's website, and my heart sank when I saw the prices. The cheapest room, a standard deluxe, was $250 a night, and that was assuming you booked immediately and didn't need any upgrades. If you waited too long, you'd be looking at $350 to $400 a night for the same room. And God forbid you needed something bigger or closer to the venue. Emily had also booked the entire weekend for the wedding festivities because, of course, this wasn't going to be a simple one-day affair. There was a Friday night welcome dinner, the Saturday wedding and reception, and a Sunday farewell brunch, all spread out over 3 days. That meant staying at the hotel for 2 or even 3 nights, which added up to at least $750 for accommodations alone, and that was before taxes and fees. Then there were the travel expenses. The hotel was located a couple of hours away from where I lived, far enough that driving back and forth wasn't an option. Gas prices weren't exactly cheap, and if I didn't want to drive, I'd have to consider taking a train or booking a ride, which would easily add another couple $100 to the total. And let's not forget parking. This was the kind of place where valet parking was the only option, and that came with a hefty daily fee. It felt like every little detail had been designed to squeeze as much money as possible out of the guests. And then came the cherry on top. Emily had specified a black tie dress code. Not semi-formal, not cocktail attire, full-on black tie. That meant long gowns for the women and tuxedos for the men. I don't know about you, but my closet isn't exactly stocked with ball gowns. The fanciest dress I own was something I'd worn to a friend's wedding 2 years ago, and it definitely didn't meet the black tie standard. So now I was looking at either buying a formal dress or renting one. Either option was going to cost me, especially if I wanted something nice enough to fit in with the aesthetic Emily was clearly going for. Even rental prices for formal evening wear aren't cheap, and buying a new gown. Forget about it, those price tags are outrageous. By the time I added everything up, the $500 contribution, the $750 hotel stay, the travel costs, the dress, I was staring at a number that hovered dangerously close to $1,500, and that didn't even include a wedding gift. Traditionally, guests bring a gift to the wedding, but at this point, I felt like my entire attendance was a gift. Wasn't the $500 contribution enough? Apparently not. There was no mention of whether gifts were expected on top of the contribution, but knowing Emily, I wouldn't be surprised if she expected both. It felt like every detail had been carefully crafted to ensure that attending her wedding would be a significant financial investment, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being punished for the privilege of watching her say I do. I sat with all of this for a few days, trying to decide what to do. My parents kept pushing me to just pay the contribution and go, saying it wasn't worth causing a rift in the family. They said I'd regret not being there, and maybe they were right, but part of me felt like caving would only enable her behavior. If I gave in now, what message would that send? That she could treat people however she wanted as long as she got what she wanted in the end. It didn't sit right with me. At the same time, the thought of skipping her wedding and potentially damaging our relationship forever was almost unbearable. I felt stuck in an impossible situation, torn between my principles and my desire to be there for my sister. All I knew was that whatever decision I made, it was going to have consequences, and honestly, I wasn't sure if there was any way to come out of this without being the bad guy in someone's eyes. Update 2. After spending days stewing over the situation, I decided I needed to get my thoughts down in writing. Talking to Emily wasn't an option. She blocked me on every form of communication, and honestly, even if she hadn't, I wasn't sure I trusted myself to keep calm during a live conversation. I knew that if I wanted to get through to her, I'd have to approach it carefully, laying everything out logically and clearly. So, I sat down at my desk one evening with a blank sheet of paper and started drafting a letter. The first draft was all frustration. I poured out every ounce of irritation and anger I'd been holding back, detailing exactly how her wedding tax and the associated costs were unfair and unrealistic. But as cathartic as it felt to vent, I knew sending something like that would only escalate the situation, so I crumpled it up and started again. This time, I tried to focus on the emotional side, on how hurt I felt by the way she was handling things and how much I wanted to be there for her without feeling financially drained. That draft was better, but it still didn't quite strike the right tone. Finally, after about 2 hours, I managed to write something that felt balanced, firm but not combative, honest but not cruel. In the letter, I explained that her wedding budget and the associated demands were creating an impossible situation for me. I laid out the numbers, what I'd calculated it would cost me to attend, including the contribution, hotel, travel, and formal attire, and made it clear that this wasn't just a matter of me being unwilling to spend the money. It was a matter of not being able to without seriously compromising my own financial stability. I reminded her that weddings are supposed to be celebrations of love and family, not events that place a financial strain on the people attending. I also pointed out that, based on conversations I had had with other family members, I wasn't the only one who felt this way. I didn't name names. I wasn't about to drag anyone else into the crossfire, but I mentioned that several people had expressed discomfort with the costs, but were too polite to say anything. I ended the letter by asking her to reconsider the way she was handling things. I suggested that she find ways to reduce the overall expenses, like choosing a more affordable venue or scaling back on some of the extras, so that the financial burden wouldn't fall so heavily on the family. I told her that I wanted to be there for her, but unless there were changes, I simply wouldn't be able to afford it. I sealed the letter, dropped it in the mail, and then spent the next week feeling a mix of dread and relief. Part of me hoped she'd take it to heart and realize how unreasonable she was being. The other part of me braced for her to dismiss everything I'd said and double down on her demands. A few weeks later, I got a notification on Messenger, and my heart skipped when I saw Emily's name pop up. After weeks of radio silence, I'll admit I was taken aback that she had even bothered to respond to my letter. Part of me dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd taken some time to think about what I said and was ready to meet me halfway. But the second I opened the message, all of that hope evaporated. It wasn't just that she dismissed my concerns, it was the tone, dripping with condescension and self-righteousness, that left me reeling. She began by saying she had received and read my letter, but instead of addressing any of the points I had carefully laid out, she went straight on the attack. She wrote that everyone else was perfectly happy with the arrangements, and no one had complained except for me. She framed it as though I was the odd one out, some unreasonable malcontent stirring up unnecessary drama. The way she phrased it, it wasn't just that I was being difficult, it was that I was being selfish. She said she was deeply disappointed that I, of all people, was refusing to support her on what she described as the most important day of her life. I read that part over and over, feeling the weight of her words sink in. It wasn't just disappointment she was expressing, it was judgment. She painted me as the bad guy in this situation, someone who couldn't see past her own needs to celebrate her sister's happiness. But what made it even worse was the way she completely sidestepped everything I'd written in my letter. There was no acknowledgement of how her demands might be unreasonable or how they were impacting others. To her, my concerns weren't valid, they were a personal attack. She went on to justify the contribution amount, claiming that it was more than reasonable given the type of wedding she was planning. She actually had the audacity to suggest that she'd been too generous by setting the amount so low. I couldn't believe what I was reading. In her mind, $500 to $1,000 per person, on top of all the additional expenses, was a bargain. She made it sound like she was doing us all a favor, like we should be grateful for the privilege of contributing to her vision. It was as if she couldn't even fathom that not everyone had that kind of disposable income, or that even if they did, they might not want to spend it on her wedding. What really pushed me over the edge, though, was the way she dismissed the idea that anyone else might be feeling the same way I did. She claimed that if anyone else had a problem with the arrangements, they would have said something by now. Clearly, she believed the silence from our family was proof that everyone was perfectly fine with her demands. But I knew better. I had spoken to several relatives once who were uncomfortable with the costs but didn't want to make waves. Yet in Emily's eyes, their silence meant they were enthusiastic supporters of her plans. And then, the final blow, she ended her message with a suggestion that if the contribution amount was such a problem for me, she might consider raising it for everyone else to make up for my shortfall. The audacity of that statement left me speechless. She wasn't just dismissing my concerns, she was threatening to punish everyone else because of me. It felt like a power play, a way of asserting control and reminding me that she was the one calling the shots. If I couldn't fall in line, then she'd simply make everyone else pay more to compensate for my selfishness. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to process what I'd just read. She wasn't just ignoring my concerns. She was actively dismissing them and using them as an excuse to potentially make things worse. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was one thing to be stubborn, but this was something else entirely. She was so wrapped up in her idea of a perfect wedding that she couldn't or wouldn't see how her actions were affecting the people around her. Against my better judgment, I replied to her message. I told her that, contrary to what she believed, other people did feel the same way I did. They just didn't want to confront her about it because they didn't want to deal with the fallout. I tried to explain that just because no one else had spoken up didn't mean they were happy with the arrangements. It just meant they were being polite. I also reiterated that this wasn't about me being unwilling to support her. It was about her creating an environment where support came with a hefty price tag that not everyone could afford. Her response was almost immediate. She accused me of making things up to justify my position and said I had no right to speak for anyone else. She wrote that she had personally spoken to every family member and that they had all enthusiastically agreed to her plans. Then she dropped the final bomb. If I didn't want to come, I should just say so and stop making excuses. She told me that if I couldn't handle the financial commitment, it was better for everyone if I just stayed home. I was floored. I couldn't believe she was willing to write me off so easily, as if my presence or lack thereof meant nothing to her unless I came with a checkbook in hand. It wasn't just the dismissiveness that hurt. It was the complete lack of understanding or empathy. She wasn't even willing to consider that her demands might be unreasonable. In her mind, the problem wasn't the wedding tax or the financial strain, it was me. I sat with her message for a long time, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. This wasn't the Emily I thought I knew. The sister I grew up with would never have treated me or anyone else this way. It felt like she had become a completely different person, someone who cared more about appearances and lavish displays than the people who were supposed to matter most to her. And as much as I wanted to find a way to salvage the situation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was fighting a losing battle.